Okay, I think we'll get started now. Thank you for coming back on time. We're going to try and end this session with a good question and answer period, so I'm glad that we can get started. My name is Margaret Wachenfeld. I'm the Director of Research and Legal Affairs at the Institute for Human Rights in Business. We are a think tank in this parallel universe that we're going to be talking about on this panel, in particular on business and human rights. And I'd like to thank David and Human Rights at Sea for putting on this conference, for bringing business and human rights to the maritime sector, and for bringing really the maritime sector to the business and human rights space, because it has been a bit missing in action in the business and human rights world that I'm going to talk about when I get to my presentation, where that discussion has been going on for about 20 years. So I'll talk about that, but I just wanted to very quickly in this opening session just put on the table a couple of other international frameworks that I haven't heard about yet this morning, and that good to add into the discussion. And that is looking at oceans and the Sustainable Development Goals. I know that there was recently issued, just in this year, finally, the first global integrated marine assessment in 2016, all 1,700 plus pages of it, looking at many of the different sectors in the marine, or different subsectors in the marine sector, and looking at their impact on the oceans, and also the value of oceans to humans. And that was not presented from a human rights, specifically from a human rights point of view, but I think it's certainly within the context of the SDGs, where there is a lot of human rights interwound in the SDGs. So I think we will see human rights coming in through that discussion as well. I know the IMO and the ILO already referred to this morning, talking about the human rights of seafarers, and I was really pleased to see as I was preparing that the IMO has a whole work program for 2016-2017 that's specifically referred to as the human rights of seafarers. And I think one of our panelists will certainly be discussing what's been going on at the UN Security Council in talking about human rights and the maritime environment. So I think very interesting to see all of these different parallel universes coming together, and what the maritime sector can learn from the business and human rights space, but also I think from our universe that Phil and I come from, of what our sector can learn from the maritime sector. And I think certainly there's some very interesting international governance arrangements in the maritime sector that I think could provide some lessons to other sectors, and to come out, and I'll talk a little more about why I think and why ILO has been talking in particular about the Maritime Labor Conference and how that provides some examples. But I think also certainly under UNCLOS and the deep seabed mining and the whole issue of tribunals and how that all works is an example for the business and human rights space in facing some of our challenges. So with that, I'm just going to give a quick introduction of our panelists, and then I'll give a quick presentation on the UN guiding principles and the business and human rights space, and then move on to the rest of the panelists. So our first panelist after me is going to be Phil Bloomer. He's the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And for those of you who are not from this little specialized business and human rights world, if there's anything you take away from this conference, it's the website of Phil's organization, because it is absolutely the go-to place for any information on business and human rights. So that, if you're going to take something away, take away Phil's organization. We then have Libby Woodach, who's head of advocacy at Seafish, and Libby's going to tell us about what her organization has been doing and bring the fishing industry into our discussion. We then have Conrad Thorpe, who is going to bring into this discussion the private military security companies operating in the maritime environment. And I know, again, from the business and human rights space, there's been a lot of focus on PMSCs, but almost none on what's happening in the maritime space, only on the terrestrial space. So very interesting to hear what lessons learned there are from those sides. And I will get him to give the name of his organization, which I was trying to pronounce in Kiswahili, but I think I'll leave it to Conrad to do that.
Thank you.
And then we have Alexandra Rage, who's from Trace. And again, she'll introduce her organization, but again, bringing another perspective in terms of thinking about where does the whole anti-corruption, anti-bribery piece fit within what we're talking about on the maritime sector, and how does that link up to human rights. And then finally we have Lisa Tremble, who's from Mishkan Daraya, which is a law firm, and she's going to help us when we get to the questions and answer period and here to answer questions. So thank you for that. In order to keep us moving, I'm going to move on to our presentation, see if we can make up a little time. Let's see, and is it? There we go. Okay, so I've already introduced myself. I've already said I'm from the IHRB. So, as I said, I'm going to talk more about this parallel universe of what's been going on in the business and human rights space, because I sense that I see a few familiar faces, but I sense that probably most people in the environment are from the maritime sector. And whenever you step across the threshold into a new sector, you find there's a whole new world out there. So I'll give a very quick overview of how we've gotten to where we are on the guiding principles, and I know David said something about them quickly. So, as I said, this discussion on business and human rights has been going on for at least 20 years. And why has it been going on? It's been going on because of this gap of, the discussions around globalization, that globalization and business connections in the world have been moved much faster than any kind of regulation has been able to keep up. And so you've got this increasing pace of globalization, decreasing pace of regulation, both at the national level, but also at the international level, and in particular the cross-border regulation that hasn't been able to keep up with business. And you've seen this governance gap widen. And as a result of the governance gap, we've had, you've had businesses increasing their connections around the world, businesses' impacts, and those impacts, the connections between business and those impacts becoming more evident as there's been, but again, a lack of regulatory connections. So this has been the response, and this is nothing new to everybody in this room, right? In terms of thinking about how much increased focus there has been, the rise of civil society, and the focus from both the environment and human rights community on this globalized world. And as a result, this discussion, as I said, on business and human rights, thinking about what is business responsibility, started about 20 years ago, but became far more crystallized in 2008, 12 years ago, when the UN appointed what's called the Special Representative to the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights. So there was a very formal 6-year consultation throughout the world involving many sectors, but I think except the maritime sector, where there was very little activity from the maritime sector in that discussion, to try to figure out what is the appropriate responsibility of business vis-a-vis human rights. Governments, for anybody who's an international lawyer, a human rights lawyer, will know under the international human rights instruments, governments have 3 levels of obligation. It's called the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So this discussion with the UN started with, is that appropriate for business to be assigned all the same obligations as a government for human rights, or is it something different? And so in the end, after 3 years of discussion, this international discussion and the UN SRSG, who's a man named John Ruggie, who's a Harvard professor, if anybody's heard, sometimes it's referred to as the Ruggie framework. John Ruggie and his team came up with this 3-pillar framework. And if you look at this 3-pillar framework, you'll see in there the 3 actors that are relevant to this discussion. You've got the state, you've got business, corporate, and you have, in a sense, Pillar 3 is about the victims, those who have had impacts on their human rights. And in particular, there was nothing quite new in this on the Pillar 1 side, because the international legal framework has always been directed to governments, but it was a reminder to governments of what their obligations are vis-a-vis business, and that is the government obligation to protect its citizens and protect those in its jurisdiction from negative human rights abuses. And that means that governments then have an obligation to regulate, to legislate, to adjudicate, to provide clear guidance to business about what is expected. The really revolutionary part of this framework was finally resolving that question that had been bubbling around for all of those years about what is it that we can expect from business vis-a-vis human rights. And now there is a very clear answer to that question, and that is business should respect human rights. If you remember, I talked about those 3 levels. Business, what's expected of business is just that first level of respecting human rights, essentially doing no harm. And I'll come back to what that means in a minute. And finally, again, the third part of this framework was to remind us all that there's not just the government, there's not just the business. Let's remember the humans, as we were reminded by Captain Szymanski, the humans in this. If humans have had impacts on their human rights, they should have a remedy. Typically, that's through the government, through a judicial or a non-judicial, but it also talks about the role of business in remedy, and we could spend a whole 3-day conference on that, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end on that. So what has been, and so there's 2 parts of this framework. There's the initial 3-pillar framework that was promoted in and adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2008. And then typically what you in the business community will always hear referred to as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's more detailed implementation on this framework. So you'll hear reference to the guiding principles, the UNGPs, and that's what you're hearing. That's already 5 years old today, and so that's what I mean about the maritime sector coming to this at a bit later stage than some others. But very quickly, there's been various responses from business, from complete having never even heard of this, which may be the case for some of you in the room, all the way through to we absolutely see businesses out there that are turning respect for human rights into a competitive advantage. So let's go back to what do the UN Guiding Principles mean for businesses in a nutshell. And again, it's about impacts on it's human rights, so it's impacts on people, on humans. If there's 2 things to take away from this presentation, it's the 2 things of businesses have a responsibility. That's now the global expectation set out in the UN Guiding Principles, which are not an internationally binding standard, but they're an authoritative norm. So businesses have responsibility. The other key issue is businesses have this responsibility wherever they operate. There are some areas of human rights that are very well regulated. We heard this morning a lot about labor issues. That's, of course, one key area where human rights are well regulated. But even where there's no regulation or regulation is not enforced, the expectation is there that business meets this baseline responsibility. So those are the 2 key points. What does the UN Guiding Principles basically say? It talks about business respect means do no harm on human rights. And it's quite a different and distinct approach from what's come to be known as the traditional corporate social responsibility, where business picked a couple of areas that they wanted to work on and do something positive. This is a different mindset. It talks about where businesses have responsibility, where businesses have impacts on people, there's responsibility. So you start from your impacts and you start from a position of responsibility, not just from what you choose to do. If you get to not only not abusing human rights, but get to the positive, great. But let's start from that baseline. And the other key issue is people sometimes when I say do no harm, they think it means do nothing. So another key issue to take away from this is do no harm does not mean do nothing. The UN guiding principles talk about an active approach to businesses understanding what kind of human rights impacts they have. And so they set for you, and again, you can dive into the guiding principles, and it talks about the kinds of steps that are expected from business to both understand, go out and actively investigate whether a business is having human rights impacts, and then managing them. So there are 3 parts to the guiding principles. Businesses adopting a policy, businesses doing human rights due diligence, that's this active piece, and providing a remedy. So Phil and I could go on for days and days. There's 10,000 pages that's now been written about this, but that's all I'm going to say on that. Just very quickly, I think, where is the maritime sector in this space? Is it here, or is it here, or is it here? Is it in the Viking Age, or is it in the modern age? And I specifically picked a picture of Maersk because, in fact, Maersk is one of the few companies that I see from my business and human rights space that's actively involved in this discussion. But certainly we're hoping to see more. And I think finally thinking about that was the where. I think how does the maritime industry have impacts on human rights? I think, again, you need to think about the different ways that the different parts of the sector interacts with humans. And it's not necessarily just one of these, because anybody in the maritime sector is going to be an employer, but there will be other impacts. I'm not going to go into that in the interest of time, and I think that we will hear more about all those different types of interactions as we go through our panel and through the discussion today. I think, why are the guiding principles a good fit for the maritime sector? I mean, they apply to all sectors, but I think in particular, you're a sector that operates outside the jurisdiction other than under international law. And so I think, again, it's particularly suited to remind that human rights apply whether you're inside the 200-mile exclusive economic zone or outside. And I think, in particular, thinking about this issue as being a globalized industry where there may not be particular laws that apply, this expectation on respecting human rights still apply. So that's it for me, other than to say, and I said I would come back to this, ILO is starting negotiations on potentially a new instrument on global supply chains, and they particularly pointed to the Maritime Labor Convention as a good model for the business and human rights community to be looking at. And that's why I said I think there's definitely learning back and forth. And so these were the points that, they pointed out about bringing, again, interesting for me when I went and looked at it to see, again, a 3-pillar approach. So there certainly should be resonance back and forth, but also the idea that it brings together government, the seafarers, and ship owners. So all 3 sides of the equation to agree on protections is a very good model for the business and human rights community. So with that, I'm going to finish, and I'm going to hand it over to Phil. Do you want to come up here? Or? Yep. Okay, they'll put your slides up. Thank you very much.